Have you ever been fatigued in the journey of faith? You ever been disappointed because the land of blessing doesn't feel very blessy where you are? The voices in your head, the voices all around you, the voices from the past, the voices of friends or family along the journey start saying or screaming, I told you this was a terrible idea. You ever have moments where you just look at where you are in the journey of following God, having been nothing but faithful to Him, wondering deep down, is this all there is? See, the beauty of a commitment to a life of faithfulness is that in it you discover not your capacity for a relentless pursuit of God, but His capacity for an unwavering commitment to you. Our faithfulness does not destroy God's capacity to bless us. Last week, Abram said yes to a promise. And he walked away from everything familiar to him, including his past. Immediately after that huge faith step, Abraham walks right into the middle of a storm. And here's what we've got as we look at his story today. You got 7 things that show up in Abraham's story. Think of them as conditions that are favorable for a storm that costs you your faithfulness. You can't avoid storms, but you can prepare for them. If you got a Bible, go ahead and meet me in Genesis chapter 12 today. Genesis chapter 12. If you weren't here last week, this is week 2 in a teaching series through the life of a guy you may be familiar with. His name is Abraham. Here's the amazing thing about Abraham. Abraham is a guy who 3 major world faiths all point to as an example of what faith looks like. And as you begin to look at his story, it's staggering because for most of his life, Abraham is anything but faithful. And that's good news for people like us. In fact, last week we saw the 1-sentence summary of Abraham's life from the perspective of the New Testament writer of the book of Hebrews, who says this in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went. Here's my favorite part. Even though he did not know where he was going. That's really the story of Abraham's whole life, which is great news if you ever feel that way. Abraham's life at most points has all of the marks of a guy who has absolutely no idea where he's going. Sometimes because of the things that are going on around him, sometimes because of things that are going on within him, and sometimes, like in the case of the story today, both. Today we're going to see Abraham as he continues his journey straight into the middle of a blinding storm. But before we get to Abraham's storm, it sort of turned into storm season around here, so I feel like it's a good time for a public service announcement for all of you from a person who spent quite a bit of time growing up in Tornado Alley about storms. So Texans, and you may know this, are great at a lot of stuff. Storm readiness is not one of those things. So let me help. When you turn on your TV or when you see Pete Delkus tweet that there is a tornado watch, you know what tornado watch means? It means absolutely nothing. It means conditions are favorable for storms to form, or basically it's springtime in Oklahoma. You know, there is a tornado watch every single day in Oklahoma, so watch means absolutely nothing. Just means that the weatherman showed up to work and wanted something to do. That's tornado watch. Tornado warning, you know what tornado warning means? Tornado warning means watch. It means there's a tornado that's been spotted in your county, and if you grab your phone and get to the front porch, you might get a picture of it. Tornado warning. The tornado sirens going off, they mean to turn on the TV. To start listening for the weatherman to say the name of your street. And if the weatherman says the name of your street, you have two options in Oklahoma. The first is take shelter. The second is take out your teeth, put on your best Sooner hat, move to the front porch, and practice your train sounds for the television interview that's coming. Those are the options when it comes to storms in Oklahoma. Now, obviously, it's funny till it's not. And I've been there a couple of times. Once as a young kid on a baseball field with my little brother. My little brother and I got separated from our parents just as a tornado dropped down right where we were. It was terrifying. The other experience was as an adult driving down I-35 with my new wife at night with no idea how bad the storm would be until we were smack in the middle of it. Where the wind was blowing and the rain was pounding and so hard that you literally could not see the highway in front of you. So we knew where we wanted to end up. We had no idea where we were going or how to get there. And we had no idea what the cars around us were doing or thinking or seeing, and no idea what it would mean for us. You ever had a moment like that? Some of us are like, that is not a road trip story. That's the story of my whole life. Had no idea when the storm was coming. Had no idea how bad it would be until I was right there in the middle of it. Now I have no idea where I'm going. I have no idea if I can get home from here. So good news. Abraham's been there. There's hope for you in the end. But before we get to hope for you, today, I want to talk to those of us that are not in a storm like that right now. Because at one point or another, that kind of storm is coming. And I don't say that to scare you, I say that to prepare you, like an Oklahoma weatherman preacher. I want you to be able to know when the conditions are favorable for a storm of faithfulness. I want you to be able to spot when a storm comes to your neck of the woods. I want you to know where it is and why. And I want you to be able to take appropriate action from wherever you are when the storm comes for you. You can't avoid storms, but you can prepare for them. Maybe to end up unlike Abraham in today's story, where a storm all around him exposes the brokenness within him and leaves a debris field all around him. Last week, Abram said yes to a promise, and he walked away from everything familiar to him, including his past. Immediately after that huge faith step, Abraham walks right into the middle of a storm. And here's what we've got as we look at his story today. You got 7 things that show up in Abraham's story. Think of them as conditions that are favorable for a storm that costs you your faithfulness. But until the very end of the story, Abraham either misses them or ignores them altogether. And he winds up with a huge mess on his hands. Pick up the story, Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 9. Abram arrives in the land, builds an altar, and he keeps walking. Verse 9. Then Abram set out and continued towards the Negev. Now, there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while, because the famine was so severe. So first condition that shows up often when a storm is present that can become a crisis of faith is famine. If you're taking notes, it's famine. It's where we ask the question, where will what I need come from? Where will what I need come from? So here's the thing. Most of us expect, even if we deny it's our theology or we wouldn't say it out loud, most of us expect that the decision to go all the way with God is going to lead us to a world where we no longer struggle. That a life of blessing will never see a battle for anything. But that's not what happens for Abraham. He trusts in the promise, and then he gets tested over and over and over. And he fails the test, even here from the very beginning. It's especially obvious if you read it without the section breaks here. God says, you're here, this is the land. And it says Abram builds an altar and worships, and then starts walking from here, you're here, to there, which is not here. There includes a place called the Negev. The Negev's the same spot that in Deuteronomy chapter 1, God calls the great and terrible wilderness. Which, side note, it's got to be pretty rough if God sitting in heaven looks down at the land where you're walking and goes, yikes. That's where Abram finds himself. And then famine hits. And as he walks here in the land that God promised, when the famine hits, Abraham's like, nope, not staying here. I'm headed to Egypt, away from here. Like living in the land of promise and blessing was fun, but who's going to meet my real needs? You ever been there? Maybe physically hungry, like Abraham, or maybe a totally different kind of famine. Where if you follow God in the path that he sent you to take, you're going to find yourself smack in the middle of a place that is not going to meet your needs in one way or the other. Physically, financially, relationally, emotionally. To stay where you're sent often means you have to trust him to provide, even when the promise doesn't seem very promising from there. So the first thing's famine. The second thing is that, it's disappointment. Abraham has to be asking at this point, is this all there is to life with God? He walked away from a pretty good life in Ur. And now he's walking through the wilderness in the middle of a famine. The land that he was promised doesn't seem any better than the land that he left. The blessing doesn't feel better than the old blessings he experienced. And there's still not a kid in the picture. Abraham's 75 years old. Have you ever been fatigued in the journey of faith? You ever been disappointed because the land of blessing doesn't feel very blessy where you are? The voices in your head, the voices all around you, the voices from the past, the voices of friends or family along the journey start saying or screaming, I told you this was a terrible idea. You ever have moments where you just look at where you are in the journey of following God, having been nothing but faithful to him? Wondering deep down, is this all there is? That's where Abraham's at. And as a result, it seems to lead him to the third thing, right? Compromise. Compromise. He seems to be asking the question, how big a deal is this really small thing? And even if he's not asking it, we have to ask it as we look at this story. I mean, think about it. Leaving the great and terrible wilderness in the middle of a famine is an understandable step of lack of faith for Abraham, isn't it? Like we look at that and go, yeah, I mean, you probably shouldn't ever walk away from the promise of God, but if you're going to walk away from the promise of God, I kind of get it here. It's not like God's going to make magical bread fall from heaven, feed you in the wilderness, is it? Okay, that's a bad example. But let's just say we get it. Let's say we look at Abraham's story, we understand why he walked away from the land into Egypt. We wouldn't advise a person to step out of faithfulness with God, but in this case, how big a deal is it really? This small, temporary disobedience from Abraham. But here's the thing with really small things. There's always a next really small thing on the other side of the really small thing. And a really small thing after that, and a really small thing after that. One small compromise can put you on the front porch of another small compromise. And not every time when you begin to drift from the path, not in every situation, but in the storm, the point is you can't ever really know. You can't see to know when the next small, understandable departure from the path is going to lead you off a cliff. In Abraham's case, it leads him from an understandable disobedience, going to Egypt, where it's only a short journey, to a completely unexplainable disobedience, which is where he goes next in the story. Once you decided that your life, think about this, is not safe in God's hands in the small things, your life has to stay in your own hands for all the things. And that's where it leads Abraham. Look at verse 11. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are." He should have stopped there. "Know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live." Okay, don't miss the miracle here. That same conversation had taken place in the Freeland household. The next line in the story would be, "And Chris rested with his fathers and was never heard from again, was buried in a shallow grave in Egypt." This is crazy, right? What Abraham does. It's unexplainable. And Bible scholars, I know about the culture, I know about the Nuzi tablets and the Hurrian custom and the archaeological finds that say there was some kind of a tradition in the place that Abraham lived where sister wives had higher rights than wife wives, and that Sarai was technically his half-sister, so it wasn't totally lying, whatever. Okay, nothing about this is okay. And nothing in Scripture leads us to let Abram off the hook for it. It's presented as an unexplainably stupid decision that puts everything God's promised in jeopardy. So 2 real quick things that we see here in what Abraham does. The first is the motive of fear. It's a condition that's present for a storm. This is a classic moment where Abram's faced with a question: are the people around me bigger than the God who is with me? And Abraham decides that they are. And look, Abram's fear was legitimate. In fact, when he goes into Egypt, what he feared is exactly what happens. It's exactly what the Egyptians did. The fear wasn't unfounded. The problem is Abraham turns in the wrong direction. He starts white-knuckling to hang on to something that God had already promised to provide and that God had already promised to preserve. It's fear. And then you notice the narcissism here too, don't you, in what Abram says to Sarai? The self-centeredness. Abram's asking, how can I use you to protect me? It's a path of narcissism. Abram's sole concern is, what's going to happen to me? To the point that he pimps out his wife with, as far as we can tell, zero regard for what's going to happen to her. And look, that's a fairly extreme example, isn't it? When you look at this story, like almost to the point that a bunch of us are like, well, I'd never do that. But can we be honest? Some of us would sell out our families for far less than that. We're not hungry. We're not in danger of dying. We just want a nicer car. We just want a bigger house. We want a higher social status, or a dependable high, or sex on demand, whatever the thing is. It's not even really about our needs if we use this language. And look, this is huge in our culture right now, this self-centeredness thing, like I've got to focus on me, even sometimes at the expense of everybody else. And in some cases, people that we are called or covenanted to focus on as well. Not saying you shouldn't care for yourself, or that Abraham shouldn't have. But if care for myself feels like it has to come at the expense of the people that I'm called to care for, be careful. Be wise. Get wise counsel. There is almost always another way. Self-centeredness is a condition that can show up in a storm and leave you and leave the people that you love picking up the debris all around you. It does for Abram. 2 more things. Read the rest of the story, verse 14. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken to his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake. Don't miss that. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. Here, write the word prosperity. Prosperity. Prosperity is where we can be tempted sometimes to ask the question, can I afford to follow God from here? Do you notice here with Abraham, who has no idea where he's going? He's walking away from the path of God and God's blessing, but smack into the middle of Pharaoh's blessing, which makes it harder and harder and harder to turn around, and less necessary for Abraham to feel like he needs God at all. Notice how the enemy orchestrates this both ways. Famine can steer you away from faithfulness, and fortune can keep you there once you're gone. Abram's disobedience, notice, led to personal gain, not just personal protection, but it was at the expense of all of the people around him. And ultimately, it's going to be at his own expense too. Think about this, especially if you know where Abram's story is going. If not, we'll get there. But the blessing of Abraham, the blessing that he gets in the land of Pharaoh, is about to make his life a whole lot more complicated. In fact, the very next scene in the story includes a family division because they can't handle all of Pharaoh's blessings. Ultimately, it leads to the demise of some of the people that Abram led here into Egypt. The conflict after that one involves a servant woman named Hagar, who almost certainly came from Egypt too. That's going to lead to a decision from Abraham from which the world is still trying to recover today. The blessing of Egypt was a monumental curse, and Abraham couldn't see it from there. Pay attention to that. Last thing, look at verse 17. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. Okay, so I don't know if you're keeping score. Remember back to the promise? Abraham was promised 3 things earlier in the chapter. Remember what it was? He was promised a land he has now left. He was promised a seed which he has now jeopardized from a wife that he's now betrayed. And he was promised that he would be blessed to the point that he would be a blessing to all of the nations of the earth, although now he is leaving a nation that God has had to curse because of him. He is 0 for 3, and we're still in the first chapter of his story. Final condition for a catastrophic storm is failure. Failure. Where you're asking the question, can there be any hope from here? You ever been there? Look, Abraham has totally blown it. Even if he said yes to God a while ago, even if he followed God for a while, even if he had a conversion story and experienced some life change, he's put a match to all of it from here. He's walking out of Egypt surrounded by relational, emotional, spiritual debris from a storm of his own making. All the conditions were present. The sirens were blaring. The weatherman wasn't just naming his street, he was showing a picture of Abram's house. And think back about the story. When did the storm get severe? When did it move from conditions are present to catastrophic damage? Do you see it in the story? You really don't see it in the story, do you? And that's sort of the thing. We don't tend to see the moment in our stories either, which is part of the reason the story's here, to encourage us to keep watch, to respond as soon as we see the conditions present, to teach us how to respond from Abram's story. So that's the question for you today. What's it like where you are? Any of these conditions present in your world today? Are conditions favorable for a storm that cost you your faithfulness? Famine of some kind or disappointment with God? Compromises, things that you know are out of His will, but you feel like are understandable for now from here. Fears, things that seem bigger than God. Do you find yourself focused on yourself at the expense of the people that you're called to focus on? Or maybe prosperity that makes you wonder if you even need God's blessings at all? Or do you find yourself far away from the God you once followed, realizing that you've made a mess of everything? You see one or two of those conditions in your life? You know what that means if you do? It means you're normal. But keep watch. Is there a faithfulness storm in your neck of the woods today? Has that already come to your street or your house? Or has it already passed by? And you find yourself sitting in the debris of decisions that you've made along the way. Good news, even there, you've got something in common with the person whose story comes to be the primary example in the Bible of a person who has faith and found faithfulness. And so much of that reputation for Abram hinges on the decision he made from the rubble. Look quickly at chapter 13, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. You see how Abraham responds from the rubble? It's hard to miss. He retraces his steps, and he goes back to the place that he started. Back to the altar. Remember that permanent structure built from hard, broken things and put together in a way that point towards God's faithfulness? And there it says he called on the name of the Lord. Remember, the altar is a consistent picture of Abraham's life all throughout his story. And here he's saying, Lord, all I've got is broken pieces. All I've got is debris. I have totally blown it. I've dishonored you. I've dishonored my family. I made a mess out of everything. I don't have anything to offer you. My life can't point to my awesomeness from here. Remember Nimrod's story last week? My strength, my status, my significance, my effort. I can't make something of myself. I've got nothing to offer you. But Lord, I'm calling out to you. If you can use broken pieces to show your faithfulness, then all of these broken pieces are yours. And you know what God doesn't do from this point in Abram's story? He doesn't say from this point in Abram's failure, well, geez, that was quick. So Abram, why don't you just head back to Ur and figure stuff out for yourself, and I'll find somebody else that I can trust more than you with my promise. God gives him grace. And look, that's the story of the whole Bible. God isn't sitting in heaven looking for perfect people that he can trust with his promise and his purpose. He's inviting broken people to call on his name and let him take the broken pieces of their life and make them into a monument of his faithfulness. To the point that, spoiler alert, he sends the ultimate seed of Abram to live perfectly and faithfully and then to die on a cross, the picture of man's unfaithfulness, in order to take our brokenness to the grave and to raise us to new life. Even from the middle of a storm, when we can't see where we're going. Here's what Abram shows us. Here's what he invites us into. And it's true for whoever you are, wherever you've been, and wherever you find yourself today. Run to the altar and take shelter. Take shelter at the altar. See, the beauty of a commitment to a life of faithfulness is that in it you discover not your capacity for a relentless pursuit of God, but his capacity for an unwavering commitment to you. Our faithfulness does not destroy God's capacity to bless us. And the broken pieces of our life can become tools and tests that allow our lives to point the way so that those of us who can't see where we're going can't miss him, even in the middle of a storm. Would you bow your head with me? Worship team's going to come back out. Our service isn't over. In fact, I'd encourage you not to bail for the parking lot quite yet. This feels like one of those messages we want to give each other the space to respond. For us to think back through that list of conditions that are present for a storm, and to look at the radar of our life and to ask what things are like where we live. And to name them before God, whether it's just one of them or all 7 of them. Whether it feels sunny and dry where you are today, like a spring afternoon in Oklahoma. You can't even imagine it raining. If you're sitting in the debris of a storm that's just passed, the beauty of the message of Jesus is the response is the same. The altar, it shields us, it protects us, it covers us, it restores us. And it invites us to find shelter in the storm. So take a second, figure out the conditions in your heart, and let's all sing our individual response together today. You to stand as we respond this morning.
I've carried a burden for too long on my own. I wasn't created to bear it alone. I hear your invitation. Let it all go. I see it now. I'm laying
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.